On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But for the Nazi officials, the war did not end with a signature. More than 7,000 people committed suicide just in Berlin that year. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and thousands of officials chose cyanide rather than face justice. Those who survived faced brutal destinies. Soviet troops summarily executed SS officers. 2 million German women were raped during the occupation of the East. 3,300,000 German prisoners died in Soviet camps. Those captured by Western allies were taken to Nuremberg, where 10 Nazi leaders were hanged, some agonizing for up to 28 minutes as they slowly strangled. In the last weeks of April 1945, while Soviet forces converged on Berlin from the east and American and British armies advanced from the west, an unprecedented epidemic of suicides began to spread throughout Germany. These were not isolated cases of despair, but a massive and organized wave of self-destruction that involved everyone from the highest leaders of the Third Reich to thousands of ordinary German citizens. This epidemic revealed the depth of Nazi fanaticism and the effectiveness of years of propaganda that had glorified death over defeat. On the 30th of April in 1945, in the depths of the Führerbunker located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler made the decision he had anticipated for months. At 3:30 in the afternoon, after marrying Eva Braun just 40 hours earlier, the German dictator retired to his private rooms. Hitler had publicly declared in August 1944 that death was merely a split second that liberated one from everything and brought eternal peace and tranquility. Now he was putting his own words into action. While Eva Braun bit on a cyanide capsule, Hitler simultaneously ingested poison and shot himself in the right temple with his service pistol, a Walther. Their bodies were quickly taken to the garden of the Chancellery, doused in gasoline, and burned while Soviet troops were less than 500 meters away. Hitler's suicide was not a solitary act, but the culmination of a culture of death that the Nazi regime itself had cultivated. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Reich, had delivered a radio speech in February of 1945, where he declared that if Germany was defeated, he would gladly take his own life, just as Cato the Younger had done in ancient Rome. On the 1st of May, just one day after Hitler's death, Goebbels fulfilled his promise in an even more terrible way. Together with his wife Magda, they first killed their 6 children, from Helga, aged 12, to Haida, aged 4, administering crushed cyanide tablets to them. Then, both parents took their own lives in the bunker garden, their bodies partially burned by subordinates who did not have time to complete the cremation before fleeing. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, attempted to secretly negotiate with the Western Allies in the final weeks of the regime. When Hitler discovered this betrayal, he stripped Himmler of all his positions in his political testament. Himmler spent the final weeks fleeing in disguise, but was captured by British troops on the 23rd of May near Nuremberg. During a routine medical examination, he bit into a cyanide capsule that he had concealed in his mouth and died in minutes, denying the Allies the opportunity to judge one of the greatest war criminals in history. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, disappeared in the chaos of the final days of Berlin. For decades, there was speculation about his fate until excavations in the 1970s revealed remains that were later confirmed to be his through DNA analysis. The evidence suggests that Bormann committed suicide with cyanide while attempting to escape from Berlin on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of May. These suicides of the elite represented only the tip of the iceberg. The figures of self-destruction in Germany during the spring of 1945 reveal a truly chilling dimension. Only in Berlin, more than 7,000 suicides were officially recorded during the year 1945, with 3,881 occurring solely in April during the battle for the city. Researchers believe that these figures are considerably lower than the actual numbers, as the chaos of war and administrative disintegration prevented the proper recording of many deaths. In some areas, the ratio of deaths by suicide exceeded all known statistics in times of peace. The military hierarchy also experienced an unprecedented wave of suicide in modern military history. Of 554 generals of the German army, 53 took their own lives in the final months of the war, or immediately after surrender. In the Luftwaffe, 14 out of 98 generals chose suicide. The Kriegsmarine recorded 11 suicides among its 53 admirals. 8 out of 41 regional leaders of the Nazi Party, known as Gauleiter, ended their own lives. 7 out of 47 senior commanders of the SS and police committed suicide. These were not individual and desperate decisions, but the logical result of years of indoctrination that had taught that death with honor was preferable to life under enemy occupation. On the 12th of April in 1945, members of the Hitler Youth distributed cyanide capsules among those present during the final performance of the Berlin Philharmonic. The program included Wagner's Twilight of the Gods, a symbolic choice that did not go unnoticed by anyone. The capsules came with detailed instructions on how to use them. This mass distribution of poison was not an isolated incident. The Nazi authorities had been providing cyanide to party officials, military officers, and loyal members for weeks, presenting it as an honorable alternative to capture. The city of Demmin, in Pomerania, experienced one of the most devastating mass suicides in German history. Between the end of April and the beginning of May of 1945, approximately 1,000 people, more than a tenth of the city's population, took their own lives before and after the arrival of the Red Army. Whole families walked toward the Tollense River with stones in their pockets. Mothers drowned their small children before drowning themselves. Men hung their wives and children before hanging themselves. Others cut their veins in bathtubs filled with water. The methods varied, but the pattern was consistent: entire families choosing death together. This phenomenon of family suicides was common throughout Germany during the spring of 1945. Records show countless cases of parents who killed their children before committing suicide, justifying it as protection against a worse fate under Soviet occupation. German women in particular feared rape by Soviet troops, a fear that Nazi propaganda had intensely fueled and which sadly proved justified in many cases. But terror was not the only motivation. Years of propaganda had convinced many Germans that life under Bolshevism would be literally worse than death. The methods of suicide reflected both planning and desperation of the moment. Cyanide was the preferred method for those who had access to it, causing death within minutes with relative efficiency. For those who did not have poison, hanging was common, as well as cutting veins, drowning, and, in some cases, the use of firearms. Medical records of the time document the variety of methods and the determination with which they were executed. In many cases, people who failed in their initial attempts tried again until they succeeded. The Nazi glorification of suicide as a heroic act had begun long before the final collapse. The movement had celebrated since its inception the deaths of activists like Horst Wessel, presenting them as noble sacrifices for the cause. Hitler himself had repeatedly declared his preference for death over defeat. In his speech to the Reichstag during the invasion of Poland in September 1939, he proclaimed that he would not take off his uniform until victory, or that he would not live to see the day of defeat. This rhetoric was not mere hyperbole, but the articulation of a creed that his followers took literally: the Soviet revenge, terror in the East. As the Third Reich crumbled, the Soviet forces converging on Berlin from the east brought with them more than just military victory. They brought vengeance. The Red Army had suffered devastating losses during 4 years of total war against Germany. 27 million Soviet citizens had died, including more than 8 million soldiers. Entire cities had been wiped out. The civilian population had experienced deliberate famines, mass deportations, and a systematic brutality that was unparalleled on the Western Front. Now, those same troops who had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long journey home brought with them a thirst for retribution, fueled by both personal suffering and years of Soviet propaganda. On the 16th of April 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the final offensive against Berlin with more than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. Marshal Ivan Konev commanded another army of similar size advancing from the south. Together, these forces represented one of the largest concentrations of military power ever assembled. But this would not be a conventional military operation. The assault on Berlin would become one of the most brutal battles of the entire Second World War, not only because of its military intensity, but also due to the violence unleashed against the civilian population. The Soviet artillery fired nearly 2 million shells during the final assault on Berlin. The Soviet commanders, in their rush to be the first to capture the German capital, accepted extraordinarily high casualty rates. Tanks advanced without sufficient infantry support, making them vulnerable to ambushes by the Hitler Youth armed with Panzerfaust rocket launchers. One single German sniper could cause the Soviet artillery to level entire buildings. The suspicion that a basement contained defenders resulted in grenades being thrown without regard for the civilian lives that might be sheltering there. When the Soviet troops finally took control of the neighborhoods of Berlin, a wave of violence against German civilians, especially women, began to spread. Historical estimates of the magnitude of the rapes vary, but even the most conservative figures are chilling. In Berlin alone, more than 100,000 women were raped during the first year of Soviet occupation. When including the regions of Pomerania, Silesia, and East Prussia during the massive exodus, the number of victims reaches approximately 2 million women. Many were raped multiple times by different soldiers. Some women who did not hide in basements all day were raped up to 15 times. The victims included girls as young as 8 years old and elderly women. An anonymous Soviet soldier articulated the prevailing mentality in a letter from 1945 sent home. "We are taking revenge for everything," he wrote, "and our revenge is just. Fire for fire, blood for blood, death for death." The Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who participated in the invasion of Germany, wrote in his poem Prussian Nights about these atrocities. "They know very well that we have come to Germany to take our revenge," he wrote with brutal honesty. The Soviet propagandist Ilya Ehrenberg had fueled this hatred with his writings that urged soldiers to break the racial pride of German women by force. The rapes were not isolated incidents committed by undisciplined soldiers, but a widespread phenomenon that Soviet commanders did little to prevent and, in some cases, implicitly allowed. A Soviet commander admitted to being deeply ashamed of the mass rapes of German women by ethnic Kazakh soldiers, described as the worst perpetrators and likened to Mongol hordes. When the German director Schmidt burst into Villa Franca and shouted at the Russian commander Isayev that his soldiers were raping German women, the German victim pointed to a Kazakh soldier as the perpetrator, who was immediately arrested. The Kazakh soldier argued that he wanted revenge against the Germans who had killed his 2 brothers in battle and was sentenced to be executed the next day. But these cases of discipline were rare exceptions amid the widespread chaos. Berlin women developed desperate strategies to survive. They smeared soot on their faces and covered themselves with old rags, trying to look unattractive. They hid in basements for days. An anonymous Berlin diarist documented these experiences, describing how women observed in paralyzing terror the Mongolian-looking Soviet soldiers through the basement windows. Their testimonies reveal not only physical trauma, but also how these experiences transformed the perception that German women had of men in general. "We are feeling sorry for them," she wrote. "A kind of collective disappointment among women seems to be growing. The world dominated by Nazi men that glorified the strong man is faltering, and with it, the myth of the man." Nazi officers and members of the SS who fell into Soviet hands faced a particularly brutal fate. Summary executions were common. There was no pretense of due process or trial. Soviet soldiers had witnessed Nazi atrocities in their own territory, had liberated camps like Majdanek, and had seen the results of the Nazi scorched earth policy. Many had lost entire families. For them, executing captured Nazis was not a crime, but justice. Testimonies document cases of SS officers being hanged from light poles in the streets or simply shot where they were captured. The treatment of German prisoners of war by the Soviets was devastating. Of the 5,700,000 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, 3,300,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of 57%. In comparison, of the 3,300,000 Soviet prisoners of war captured by Germany, more than 3 million died, a rate of 90%. The brutality was reciprocal, but this did not make it less devastating for those who suffered it. The German prisoners were used as slave labor to reconstruct the Soviet Union. They were sent to work in forests, swamps, and canals for 15 or 16 hours a day. Malnutrition was widespread, and the Soviet economy desperately needed workers and leaders to clear debris, rebuild infrastructure, and obtain foreign currency to buy food and other essential resources. More than half of the deported died in the following 2 years. Among the survivors, more than half of the women had been raped. The systematic looting also characterized the Soviet occupation. The soldiers of the Red Army, many of whom came from impoverished rural areas, were astonished by the material goods they found in German homes, even in those that had been bombed. Clocks, bicycles, tableware, clothing, anything transportable was considered legitimate loot. The Soviet government officially sanctioned the appropriation of trophy goods by its troops, although it established theoretical limits that were rarely respected. The trains heading east were loaded with complete industrial machinery, scientific equipment, and artistic treasures. However, the narrative cannot be reduced to a simple story of Soviet brutality. The testimonies also document individual acts of kindness and protection by Soviet soldiers. Some Soviet officers tried to protect German civilians from their own soldiers. Some soldiers shared their rations with hungry German children. The reality was complex and contradictory, with acts of humanity occurring alongside terrible atrocities. But these exceptions could not hide the general pattern of violence and vengeance that marked the initial Soviet occupation. Arrests and detentions. The net is closing. While the smoke from the final battles still lingered over the German cities, the Western Allies began the monumental task of administratively dismantling the Third Reich. This process involved not only the capture of the surviving leaders, but also the identification, classification, and processing of millions of Germans who had served the Nazi regime in varying degrees of responsibility. The magnitude of the challenge was unprecedented in military and legal history. Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed by Hitler as his successor in his political testament, had assumed the position of President of the Reich and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces following the suicide of the Führer. From the city of Flensburg, near the Danish border, Dönitz attempted to maintain some semblance of a functional German government. On the 7th of May, 1945, Dönitz sent General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Operations Staff of the High Command of the Armed Forces, to Reims to negotiate the surrender of all German forces with General Dwight Eisenhower. Jodl signed the unconditional military surrender and ceasefire agreement, which would come into effect on the 8th of May at 11:23 p.m. However, the Soviets insisted on a second, more formal surrender ceremony in Berlin. Stalin argued that allowing Jodl, who had been delegated by Dönitz as head of state, to sign for Germany in the Second World War could open the door to a new stab-in-the-back myth, similar to the one Hitler had exploited after the First World War. The Allies decided to reenact the surrender with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the supreme commander of all German forces, personally signing the document. On the 8th of May at 11 o'clock, Keitel entered the Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst, Berlin, wearing his monocle and field marshal's baton, his face showing a mask of disdain, contempt, and arrogance. He signed the document while wearing his golden emblem of the National Socialist Party. The government of Flensburg under Dönitz continued to operate briefly under Allied supervision. The Allies had a problem because they realized that although the German armed forces had surrendered unconditionally, the Sheikh had not used the document created by the European Advisory Commission, and therefore there had not been a formal surrender of the German civil government. This was considered a very important issue because just as the civil surrender, but not the military one, in 1918 had been used by Hitler to create the stab-in-the-back argument, the Allies did not want to give any future hostile German regime a legal argument to resurrect an old dispute. On the 23rd of May in 1945, acting under orders from the Chef and with the approval of the Soviets, the American Major General Rooks summoned Dönitz aboard the Patria and informed him that he and all members of his government were under arrest and that his government was dissolved. Dönitz was detained along with Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, and General Alfred Jodl. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine and one of the signatories of the surrender, committed suicide that same night by ingesting cyanide. The arrested individuals were subsequently flown to England and imprisoned to await trial for war crimes. But these high-profile arrests were just the tip of the iceberg. At the end of 1945, 3.5 million former Nazis awaited classification, many of whom were prevented from working in the meantime. Nazi bureaucracy had been extensive and deeply integrated into all aspects of German society. Teachers, police officers, judges, postal workers, engineers, doctors, almost all professions had required at least nominal membership in the Nazi Party or its affiliated organizations. Determining who was a war criminal, who was an opportunist, and who had simply tried to survive in a totalitarian state posed enormous ethical and practical challenges. The denazification program was launched after the end of the war and was solidified by the Potsdam Agreement in August 1945. The objective was to eliminate those who had been members of the Nazi Party or the SS from positions of power and influence, dissolve the organizations associated with Nazism, and try prominent Nazis for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials. However, the implementation of this program varied greatly between the occupation zones. The Soviet zone applied draconian measures, while in the Western zones the process was gradually softened as the Cold War emerged and West Germany became a necessary ally against the Soviet Union. The first internment camps established by the Western Allies were the Rhine-Wiesenlager, camps set up in Western Germany to house hundreds of thousands of captured or surrendered Axis personnel. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force reclassified all prisoners as unarmed enemy forces, not prisoners of war. This legal fiction circumvented the provisions of the Geneva Convention of 1929 regarding the treatment of former combatants. In October, thousands had died in the camps from hunger, exposure, and disease. Malnutrition was widespread, and the economy needed leaders and workers to help clear debris, rebuild infrastructure, and earn foreign currency to purchase food and other essential resources. In January of 1946, a directive from the Control Council titled Removal of Nazi and Hostile Persons from Positions of Responsibility was issued. One of the punishments for Nazi involvement was exclusion from public office and/or being restricted to manual or simple work. By the end of 1945, 3.5 million former Nazis were awaiting classification. By the end of winter of 1945 to 1946, 42% of public officials had been dismissed. The Nazis who were found guilty were often punished with fines evaluated in Reichsmarks, which had become almost worthless. While the military government was aware of the nominal cost of the fines, requiring a hearing for each case prevented mass absolutions of many individuals. In Bavaria, the denazification minister, Anton Pfeiffer, resisted the victor's justice and presided over a system that reintegrated 75% of the officials that the Americans had dismissed and reclassified 60% of senior Nazis. The denazification process lost great credibility, and there was often local hostility against Germans who helped administer the courts. Threats and even violence against tribunal members had become quite common. In the early 1947, the Allies had 90,000 Nazis in detention. Another 1,900,000 were prohibited from working as anything other than manual labourers. The British, to a certain extent, avoided being overwhelmed by the potential number of denazification investigations by requiring that no one needed to fill out the Fragebogen questionnaire unless they were applying for an official or responsible position. This difference between American and British policy was criticized by Americans and caused some Nazis to seek refuge in the British zone. However, the British were particularly zealous during the first months of occupation in bringing to justice anyone, soldiers or civilians, who had committed war crimes against prisoners of war or captured Allied air crews. In June of 1945, an interrogation center in Bad Nendorf was opened, where detainees were tortured with exposure to cold, beatings, deprivation of sleep, and denial of food. A public scandal arose, and the center was eventually closed. The Nuremberg Trials, International Justice. On the 20th of November 1945, at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, an unprecedented legal experiment in human history began. For the first time, leaders of a defeated nation would be judged not by summary vengeance, but through a formal judicial process for crimes that challenged existing legal categories. The choice of Nuremberg as the venue was deliberately symbolic. This city had been the setting for the monumental rallies of the Nazi Party, where hundreds of thousands of followers acclaimed Hitler under banners displaying swastikas. Now, in that very city, the Nazi regime would face its final reckoning. The International Military Tribunal was established by the London Charter on the 8th of August in 1945, signed by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The tribunal's jurisdiction covered three categories of crimes that would together define international criminal law for the decades to come. Crimes against peace included the planning, initiation, and conduct of wars of aggression. War crimes encompassed violations of the laws or customs of war, including murder, mistreatment, or deportation for forced labor of civilian populations in occupied territories. Crimes against humanity comprised murder, extermination, slavery, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population, or persecutions for political, racial, or religious reasons. 24 Nazi leaders were initially accused, although only 21 were finally tried. Martin Bormann was tried in absentia, presumed dead, but never found at that time. Robert Ley, the leader of the German Labour Front, committed suicide in his cell before the trial began, hanging himself with a towel. Gustav Krupp, the arms industrialist, was considered mentally and physically incapable of facing the trial due to his advanced age and dementia. The defendants in the dock represented the core of Nazi leadership: Hermann Göring, second in command to Hitler and commander of the Luftwaffe; Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs; Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces; Alfred Rosenberg, the party's racial ideologist; Hans Frank, the brutal governor of occupied Poland. The courtroom had been specially adapted for this historic trial. The Palace of Justice had been expanded by German prisoners to accommodate up to 1,200 detainees. The room itself contained benches for the defendants, positions for the prosecutors from the four Allied powers, areas for the defense, and press galleries that would attract journalists from all over the world. For the first time in judicial history, a real-time simultaneous translation system was implemented to accommodate the multiple languages spoken by judges, prosecutors, defendants, and witnesses. The interpreters worked in glass booths, providing instant translations in English, French, German, and Russian. The American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, delivered the opening speech on the 21st of November 1945. "This is not merely a murder trial," Jackson stated before the court. He insisted that the court, as an agent of the United States and as the voice of humanity, must mark these acts and the ideas that engendered them as barbaric and criminal. Jackson referred to hundreds of tons of documents that had been assembled and worked on since the end of the war. The Nazis had been meticulous in their records, and now those same records would be used to condemn them. The evidence presented during the 10 months of the trial was overwhelming and devastating. The prosecutors projected films taken by Allied military photographers during the liberation of the concentration camps. The graphic scenes of what took place in Europe were the most powerful evidence presented against the Nazis at the trial. piles of emaciated corpses, gas chambers, crematoria, survivors reduced to living skeletons, all recorded on celluloid. The defendants in the dock watched, some with expressions of feigned shock, others looking away, a few showing genuine discomfort. The film Nazi Concentration and Prison Camps was projected, a documentary of almost 1 hour specifically compiled for the trial. It showed the conditions found in Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Mauthausen, and other camps. The visual evidence was undeniable. The Nazi plan was also shown, a film compiled from Nazi propaganda footage documenting the rise of the party to power and its genocidal intentions. The Nazis' own words and images condemned them. Survivor witnesses of the Holocaust provided testimony. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a fighter of the French resistance and a survivor of Auschwitz, described what she had witnessed. The selections on the ramp, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria running day and night, medical experiments performed without anesthesia. Her testimony caused several of the accused to look away. The French prosecutors, more than their British or American counterparts, emphasized the complicity of many Germans. They barely mentioned the charge of aggressive war and instead focused on forced labor, economic plunder, and massacres. The documents presented as evidence included signed orders, internal memoranda, confidential directives, and correspondence that revealed the systematic planning and execution of genocidal policies. The protocol of the Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January of 1942, where Nazi officials discussed the implementation of the final solution, was presented as evidence. Memoranda on the construction and operation of gas chambers, orders for mass executions of Soviet commissars and Jews, directives for the euthanasia program Action T4, all were exposed before the court and before the world. The defendants adopted various defense strategies. Most tried to blame Hitler for all the crimes of the regime. Hitler was mentioned 12,000 times during the trial, more than the combined total of the 5 main defendants. Other absent and deceased men, including Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and Bormann, were also blamed. The defendants tried to present themselves as victims of Nazi oppression who were dedicated to caring for patients or who were simply following orders. Karl Brandt argued that he was deeply religious, humane, and an admirer of Albert Schweitzer. Joachim Murugowski cited his edition of the Ethics of the Romantic physician Hufeland. Hermann Göring adopted a different strategy. He expected to be executed but vindicated in the eyes of the German people. During his 8 days of testimony, Göring attempted to justify Nazi policies and defend the regime. He argued that his actions had been necessary to restore German pride after the Treaty of Versailles. His considerable intelligence and experience in interrogations made him a formidable witness, although his arrogance ultimately harmed him. The defense lawyers tried to argue that the Allies had committed similar crimes, a defense known as tu quoque. They cited the bombing of Dresden, the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet crimes in Poland. But the court's letter did not recognize the tu quoque defense, asking for exoneration on the grounds that the Allies had committed the same crimes for which the defendants were accused. The judges consistently rejected these arguments, although not without internally acknowledging the moral complexities they raised. The defense also attempted to argue that the defendants were simply following orders and that it was unfair to judge them for actions ordered by their superiors. The prosecutors responded that the principle of individual responsibility must be applied regardless of the chain of command. Professional soldiers cannot escape punishment for waging aggressive wars and allowing crimes against humanity with the claim that they were duly fulfilling orders from superiors. This rejection of the defense of following orders would become a fundamental pillar of international law. On the 1st of October 1946, after 216 judicial sessions, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. Of the 21 defendants who were tried, 19 were convicted and 3 acquitted. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart, and Bormann in absentia. 3 received life sentences: Rudolf Hess, Walter Funk, and Erich Raeder. 4 received prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years: Karl Dönitz, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, and Konstantin von Neurath. The 3 acquitted were Hjalmar Schacht, former Minister of Economics, Franz von Papen, former Vice-Chancellor, and Hans Fritzsche, head of radio at the Ministry of Propaganda. The judges emphasized in their verdict that there had been a premeditated conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, whose objectives were the disruption of European order and the creation of a greater Germany beyond the borders of 1914. Contrary to Jackson's argument that the conspiracy began with the founding of the Nazi Party in 1920, the verdict dated the conspiracy from Hitler's rise to power in January of 1933. The court also declared several Nazi organizations guilty as criminal entities. The leadership of the Nazi Party, the SS, the Gestapo, and the SD were all declared criminal organizations. This meant that membership in these organizations could be used as evidence of guilt in subsequent trials. However, the court declined to declare the body of state staff officers and the High Command of the Armed Forces as criminal organizations, a controversial decision that reflected the persistent influence of traditional military hierarchies. The verdicts were received with mixed reactions in Germany and around the world. Many Germans saw the trials as victors' justice, arguing that the Allies were imposing standards that they themselves had not upheld. Others acknowledged the need to hold Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. Globally, the trial was largely seen as a triumph of justice over vengeance, although critics pointed out the inconsistencies and selectivity in the process. But the International Military Tribunal was just the beginning. Between December of 1946 and April of 1949, 12 additional military tribunals for war crimes against leaders of Nazi Germany were held by the United States in the Palace of Justice. These subsequent Nuremberg trials judged 177 additional defendants: high-ranking doctors, judges, industrialists, SS commanders, police, military personnel, civilian officials, and diplomats. The trials uncovered the German leadership that supported the Nazi dictatorship. The first subsequent trial was the Doctors' Trial, which began on the 9th of December 1946. 20 doctors and 3 SS officials were accused for their voluntary participation in war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically for their conduct of deadly medical experiments on prisoners of concentration camps. The experiments included high-altitude tests in low-pressure chambers in Dachau, where prisoners were subjected to conditions that simulated altitudes of up to 20,000 meters. The extreme pressure caused such pain that the victims pulled out their hair and beat their heads against the walls with their hands, screaming in an effort to relieve the pressure in their eardrums. It was often used as a method of execution. The executions, the gallows of Nuremberg. In the early hours of the 16th of October in 1946, the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison was transformed into the stage for the final act of the drama that had begun with the arrests of May in 1945. 3 temporary gallows made of black wood had been erected in this space that just 3 days earlier had been used by American security guards for a basketball game. The gallows stood approximately 2.5 meters tall, with a platform of 2 square meters. 13 wooden steps led to each platform. 2 of the gallows would be used alternately for the executions, while the third would remain as a backup in case of mechanical failure. The executioners were Master Sergeant John Woods of the United States Army and his assistant, military police officer Joseph Malta. Woods, a veteran of 35 years from the United States Army, had carried out numerous military executions. However, tonight's executions would be the most significant of his career and ultimately the most controversial. Woods had decided to use the standard drop method instead of the long drop method favored by British executioners. The difference was crucial. A carefully calculated long drop according to the weight of the condemned would break the neck instantly, causing quick death. A shorter standard drop often resulted in slow strangulation, a much more agonizing form of death. Approximately at 1:10 in the morning, the guards began to bring the condemned one by one from their cells, located 35 meters from the gym. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was the first to be taken to the execution chamber. At 12:30 the night before, the press correspondents had been allowed to inspect the cell block and observe the condemned. Jodl was writing a letter. Ribbentrop was in serious conversation with a chaplain. Sauckel was nervously pacing the floor. Göring pretended to be sleeping, his hands outside the blankets. At 12:45, the guard noticed Göring writhing. He called the corporal of the guard, and they ran into the cell. They saw Göring writhing in agony. When the doctor arrived, the death rattle was in his throat. Göring had outsmarted the executioner. Ribbentrop walked firmly to the foot of the 13 steps that led to the scaffold. He was asked to state his name. Flanked by 2 guards and followed by a chaplain, he slowly climbed the stairs. On the platform he saw the executioner with the rope of 13 loops and the assistant executioner with the black hood. He stood on the trapdoor and his feet were tied with an army belt. He was asked to give his last words. God protect Germany. God have mercy on my soul. My last wish is that German unity be maintained, that an understanding be reached between the East and the West, and that there be peace for the world. As the black hood was placed over his head, von Ribbentrop looked straight ahead. Then the executioner adjusted the rope, pulled the lever, and von Ribbentrop fell to his fate. He died at 1:29. The Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel entered the chamber 2 minutes after the trapdoor fell under von Ribbentrop, while the latter still hung at the end of his rope. Keitel was the first military leader to be executed under the new concept of international law, the principle that professional soldiers cannot escape punishment for waging aggressive wars and allowing crimes against humanity by claiming that they were duly following orders from superiors. Keitel wore his full field marshal uniform, except for the insignia that had been removed. When he spoke his last words, his voice was low but intense. He invoked Almighty God to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their death for the fatherland before me. Now I follow my children. Germany forever. He fell to his death at 1:34. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Main Security Office and one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was the third to ascend to the gallows. Tall and with mournful scars on his face, Kaltenbrunner had overseen the implementation of the final solution after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. His last words were, "I love my German people and my homeland with a burning heart. I did my duty according to the laws of my people, and now I lament that my people were led by men who were not appreciated by foreign powers, and that those foreign powers now seek the ruin of Germany. It was not my wish to wage war against the United States, but in the future, may its greatness and its dominion not be abused by evil. The Germans must remain united. God protect Germany and make Germany great again. God have mercy on my soul." He died at 1:42. Alfred Rosenberg, the main racial theorist of Nazism and author of The Myth of the 20th Century, had been one of the ideologues who provided the intellectual justification for genocide. As Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, he had overseen the systematic looting of artistic treasures and the implementation of extermination policies. Unlike the other condemned, Rosenberg did not utter final words. He simply shook his head when given the opportunity. He died at 1:49. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, had presided over one of the most brutal regimes of the war. Under his administration, millions of Poles and Jews were murdered, enslaved, or deported. Frank had experienced a supposed religious conversion in his cell, returning to the Catholicism of his youth. His last words reflected this conversion. "I ask God to accept my soul with mercy. I am grateful for the kind treatment I received during my imprisonment, and I ask God to accept my surrender with mercy." He died at 1:58. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior of the Reich and co-author of the Nuremberg laws that had stripped German Jews of their citizenship, writes, ascended the gallows at 2 o'clock in the morning. Frick had been instrumental in transforming Germany into a totalitarian state. His last words were simple: "Long live eternal Germany." He died at 2:05. Julius Streicher, editor of the violently anti-Semitic Der Stürmer, was the most disturbing of those condemned during his execution. Streicher had spent decades publishing propaganda that depicted Jews as subhuman, poisoners of Aryan blood, and mortal enemies of Germany. His newspaper had reached a circulation of almost 500,000 copies at its peak. As he climbed to the gallows, Streicher shouted, "Heil Hitler!" When asked to state his name, he shouted, "It is you, Americans, who will someday be judged for this murder. This is the Purim Fest of 1946. His references to the Jewish holiday of Purim revealed his persistent anti-Semitic obsession until the end. He continued to shout as the hood was placed over his head, "Now I go with God. The Germans will bring me death." As he looked towards the trapdoor, he shouted, "I will go ahead. I will move forward." The trapdoor opened at 2:12. Streicher was the only one who mentioned Hitler directly in his final moments. Fritz Sauckel, plenipotentiary for labor deployment, had been responsible for the forced labor program that had deported more than 5 million people from occupied territories to Germany to work under brutal conditions. His last words were, "I die innocent. The sentence is incorrect. God protect Germany and make Germany great again. Long live Germany. God protect my family." He died at 2:26. Beyond Nuremberg. Other destinations. The executions in Nuremberg and the prison sentences imposed by the International Military Tribunal represented only a fraction of the reckoning that followed the collapse of the Third Reich. Throughout Europe, hundreds of thousands of lower-ranking Nazis, collaborators, and regime officials faced various fates ranging from summary justice to formal trials, from successful reintegration into society to lives lived in permanent flight. The post-Nuremberg justice was uneven, inconsistent, and frequently influenced by political considerations of the emerging Cold War. In the recently liberated concentration camps, some of the most raw forms of justice developed immediately. When American troops liberated Dachau on the 29th of April 1945, the surviving prisoners, many of whom had been reduced to living skeletons after years of brutality, took their revenge on their captors. SS guards who had terrorized the prisoners for years were beaten to death. Some American soldiers, horrified by what they found in the camp, lined up dozens of SS guards against a wall and executed them. Photographs taken at that moment show an ex-prisoner attacking a German soldier on the ground. These summary executions violated the rules of war, but reflected the visceral fury provoked by the atrocities of the camp. Similar scenes occurred in other liberated fields. In Mauthausen, prisoners threw some SS guards off the walls of the quarry where they had forced thousands of prisoners to work to death. In Bergen-Belsen, where Anne Frank had died only weeks before the liberation, the captured guards were forced to bury the thousands of bodies that had been left decomposing in piles. Some prisoners tried to throw themselves at the guards, and the British soldiers had to intervene to prevent lynchings. National trials in previously occupied countries prosecuted tens of thousands of Nazis and collaborators. In Poland, where the Nazis had implemented some of their most brutal policies, Polish courts judged over 40,000 Germans for war crimes. Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, was tried by a Polish court and executed by hanging in April of 1947 in the Auschwitz camp itself, near the commander's villa, where he had lived with his family while overseeing the murder of more than 1 million people. Amon Goeth, the brutal commander of the Plazow camp immortalized in the film Schindler's List, was also tried and executed in Poland. In Czechoslovakia, the trial and execution of Karl Hermann Frank, protector of the Reich of Bohemia and Moravia, drew massive attention. Frank had ordered the destruction of the village of Lidice in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, resulting in the execution of all the men of the village and the deportation of women and children. Frank was executed by public hanging on the 22nd of May in 1946, before a crowd of 5,000 people. Local collaborators often faced particularly harsh fates. Ferenc Szalasi, leader of the Arrow Cross fascist movement in Hungary, who had worked alongside the Nazis, was tried and executed by firing squad in Budapest in March of 1946. Vidkun Quisling, whose name became synonymous with betrayal after collaborating with the Nazis in Norway, was tried and executed by a firing squad in October of 1945. Pierre Laval, head of government of Vichy France, who had actively collaborated with the Nazis in the deportation of French Jews, was executed by a firing squad in October of 1945 after a failed suicide attempt with cyanide. In the Netherlands, Anton Mussert, leader of the Dutch National Socialist movement, was executed. In Belgium, Léon Degrelle, leader of the Rexist fascist party, managed to escape to Spain, where he lived in exile, until his death in 1994. This disparity in fates would become common. Some collaborators faced swift justice, others managed to flee and live comfortable lives in exile. France conducted its own purging after liberation. Estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 20,000 collaborators were executed in summary executions during the period immediately following liberation. Others were formally tried. Approximately 7,000 were executed after trials. 40,000 were imprisoned. French women accused of horizontal fraternization with German soldiers were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved and displayed in the streets. While some had collaborated voluntarily, others had simply tried to survive under occupation. The process of denazification in the Western occupation zones produced mixed results. The questionnaires required Germans to declare any affiliation with the Nazi Party or its organizations. The accused were categorized into 5 groups: principal offenders, offenders, minor offenders, followers, and exonerated individuals. However, the process became increasingly softened as the Cold War intensified. By 1948, Allied priorities had changed. West Germany was now seen as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and there was pressure to allow less committed former Nazis to reintegrate into society. This growing leniency led to disturbing results. Hans Globke, who had co-authored the official commentary on the Nuremberg laws that stripped Jews of their rights, became Chief of Staff to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in West Germany. Reinhard Gehlen, Nazi intelligence general on the Eastern Front, was recruited by the CIA and established West Germany's intelligence service, the BND. Numerous former members of the SS and the Gestapo found employment in West Germany's security services. Nazi rocket scientists, led by Werner von Braun, were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip to work on the American space program, their Nazi pasts conveniently whitewashed. The fate of the Nazi officials after the surrender of Germany resonates through the following decades in ways that the organizers of the Nuremberg trials could hardly have imagined. The legal principles established in that gymnasium converted into a courtroom, the categories of crimes codified in the London Charter, and the precedent of individual responsibility for state atrocities would fundamentally transform international law and establish standards by which future regimes and leaders would be judged. The principles of Nuremberg, as codified by the United Nations International Law Commission in 1950, established several revolutionary concepts. First, that individuals have international duties that transcend the national obligations of obedience imposed by individual states. Second, that the fact that a person acted in accordance with domestic law does not exempt them from liability under international law. Third, that the fact that a person acted according to orders from their government or a superior does not exempt them from responsibility, although it may be considered in mitigation of punishment. These principles formed the basis for later developments in international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 expanded and codified protections for victims of armed conflict, incorporating lessons learned from the Second World War. The Nuremberg Code established fundamental ethical principles for human medical experimentation that remain central to biomedical research. The Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, defined genocide as a crime under international law. However, the application of these principles proved to be selective and inconsistent. During the Cold War, geopolitical considerations often triumphed over justice for war crimes. The massive crimes committed under Stalin in the Soviet Union were never prosecuted internationally. Atrocities during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and numerous other conflicts rarely resulted in significant prosecutions. The American bombing of civilians in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the use of chemical weapons, the massacres of civilian populations, all occurred without American leaders facing Nuremberg-style trials. The Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge, which resulted in the death of approximately 2 million people between 1975 and 1979, was not addressed by international courts until decades later. The trials finally took place between 2007 and 2018, long after many of the main perpetrators had died. Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, died under house arrest in 1998 without facing a formal trial. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994, where approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in 100 days, led to the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. This tribunal, established by the United Nations Security Council, represented the first attempt since Nuremberg to prosecute perpetrators of genocide in an international court. The tribunal prosecuted 93 individuals, including Prime Minister Jean Kambanda, who pleaded guilty to genocide, becoming the first head of government to do so. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s led to the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This tribunal judged 161 individuals for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Radovan Karadzic, leader of the Bosnian Serbs, was sentenced to life imprisonment for genocide. Ratko Mladic, Bosnian Serb military commander responsible for the Srebrenica massacre, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Slobodan Milosevic, former president of Serbia, was tried but died before his trial was completed. These ad hoc tribunals ultimately led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002, based in The Hague. The ICC has jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. It represents the most ambitious attempt to date to create a permanent system of international criminal justice. However, the ICC faces significant limitations. Powerful states including the United States, China, Russia, and India are not parties to the Rome Statute that established the court. The court has been criticized for disproportionately focusing on African crimes while ignoring atrocities committed by Western powers. The lessons of Nuremberg also informed approaches to transitional justice in societies emerging from conflicts or repressive regimes. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, most notably the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa after apartheid, attempted to balance the needs for justice, truth, and national reconciliation. These approaches acknowledged that in deeply divided societies, Nuremberg-style trials for all perpetrators can be both logistically impossible and counterproductive to peace building. However, the legacy of Nuremberg also includes unresolved issues and ongoing debates. The accusation of victors' justice was never completely answered. The Allies in Nuremberg judged the Nazis for crimes that they themselves had committed in different forms. The strategic bombing of German cities had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed more than 200,000 people, overwhelmingly civilians. The Soviet crimes, from the Katyn massacre to the mass deportations of entire populations, never faced similar scrutiny. The principle that initiating an aggressive war is itself an international crime, established in Nuremberg, has been applied extremely selectively. The United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on false claims about weapons of mass destruction, did not result in prosecutions of American leaders. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022 has also not resulted in significant trials of Russian leaders. Although the ICC has issued arrest warrants, this selectivity raises fundamental questions about the nature of international justice. Can there be true justice when only the weak are prosecuted while the powerful evade responsibility? Are international tribunals tools of genuine justice or merely instruments of geopolitical power? Does the inconsistent application of legal principles undermine their legitimacy? Despite these limitations, the legacy of Nuremberg remains significant. The trials established that certain acts are universally criminal, regardless of political or military context. They thoroughly documented the Nazi atrocities, creating a historical record that makes Holocaust denial morally unsustainable and legally punishable in many countries. The trials established the principle that following orders is not a defense for atrocities, placing moral responsibility on individuals even within hierarchical military structures. The preservation of evidence in Nuremberg also established standards for the documentation of war crimes that remain relevant. The thousands of pages of transcripts, the hundreds of thousands of documents presented as evidence, the photographs and recordings, all formed an unparalleled historical archive. This archive has allowed generations of historians, educators, and students to study not only what occurred, but also how it occurred, who was responsible, and how entire societies can be drawn into participating in mass atrocities. The documentation of the Holocaust in the trials also contributed to the development of the academic field of Holocaust studies. Understanding how genocide is planned, implemented, and denied has informed genocide prevention efforts around the world. Organizations such as the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience work to preserve sites of atrocities and use those sites for education about human rights. The imperative to never forget, rooted in the documentation of Nuremberg, motivates these efforts. However, the story after Nuremberg also demonstrates how difficult it is to prevent genocide. Despite the promise of never again articulated after the Holocaust, the world has witnessed numerous genocides and mass atrocities since 1945. The genocide in Bangladesh in 1971, the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the Yugoslav wars, the ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, all occurred after the world had supposedly learned the lessons of the Holocaust. This repetition of atrocities suggests that while legal justice may hold individual perpetrators accountable after the fact, it is much less effective in preventing atrocities before they occur. Prevention requires political will to intervene early in deteriorating situations, a will that is often absent when economic or geopolitical interests advise against intervention. The international community watched for weeks as the genocide in Rwanda unfolded, aware of what was happening but unwilling to intervene in a meaningful way.